I can't believe she pronounced phytopathological. We were once at a meeting and they had American Psychopathological Society on the signs outside the hotel, which fits right in, right? Pretty close. Well, thank you, Jan, and thank you all for attending our presentation today. I'm going to dive right into our presentation because we have a lot to say. We have a lot to do over the next few years, and the first thing we have to do is think about feeding the world's population. As we know from many projections, there are about over 9 billion people projected by 2050. In order to feed those people, just the food, we have to increase productivity by about 70% globally. Agricultural productivity, meaning the food, feed, and fiber, needs to double in that period of time. Many of you remember the Green Revolution of the 60s, and we do not have such a revolution up our sleeves at this point in time. So the task that we face is monumental. Just to nourish these people, we need to think about what we're doing right now, which is not doing a very good job. Even if we in the US are fed well, there are a lot of people out there that are dying of malnutrition and hunger. Over 9 million people deaths a year, or 9 million people die a year. 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night. And these numbers don't even reflect the impact of hunger and malnutrition on these other diseases that are listed up here. To solve these crucial problems of nourishing the world, we have a lot of scientific advances that need to be made over the next few years. We could intensify agriculture on the land masses that we have at the current time and probably do a pretty good job of feeding the people in 2050. But even if we intensify this agriculture, and we use our 28% of the land that we're already using for agricultural productivity, including food production and animal production, we probably wouldn't be able to do the task that we need to do because we have competition for the land that we're using already. We have competition with urbanization. People are expanding out into prime farmlands. And as they expand into prime farmlands, unfortunately, they're polluting our agricultural systems in ways that are depleting the soils or actually making the soils unproductive. Already 1.5 billion people in the world depend on degraded soils for their livelihoods or food productivity. All of this is exacerbated by the fact that we're experiencing very weird climate shifts. Many of you have experienced droughts if you live in Colorado or California. And these are increasing the pressures on our critical resources, as we heard in the critical resource panel earlier. Ag now uses 70% of the extracted water for productivity at this point in time. And it's predicted that we're going to need 89% of the water that's extracted from the ground by 2050 to feed that population that's coming up. Graff, our economist on the panel, will be talking about some of the innovations at CSU that will address these issues in the future. The bottom line is that we need to produce more food, I think, more food in order to feed the world's population. And we need this food to be safe and nutritious, and not only nutritious, but it should have health benefits, as you're going to hear in the next panel. And our practices to secure that food productivity need to be sustainable. In other words, we need to intensify our food production in a sustainable way. Well, this afternoon, my colleagues and I are going to share a very few examples of how CSU is approaching these challenges to ensure secure food in the future. And I want you to listen, as you heard in the first panel, that we think about this as a system. We don't think about it as agriculture alone. We think about it as all of the fields that surround us, engineering, physics, microbiology, working together to solve these problems. Well, Scott Haley is an extraordinary wheat breeder at Colorado State. And like many of us, Scott goes to bed at night worrying about the fact that we have only 35 years to figure this problem out. And 35 years to a plant biologist is 35 breeding cycles for an annual crop. 35 breeding cycles to solve this problem and feed 9 billion people. Normally, Scott is a wheat breeder, and it takes him 12 years to take a wheat variety from finding the traits that he wants to introduce it into it, and then releasing an improved variety. 12 years, and he's got 35. Well, wonderfully, using new genetic and genomic modern techniques to enhance breeding, Scott and his colleagues have been able to reduce that from 12 to 6 years to release of a new variety. 6 years is half. It's still not going to get us where we need to be, but it's a vast improvement, and he's in fact releasing a variety in the near future that yields 1.7 times the amount that the previous varieties yielded. This is a significant improvement. Some of the most important traits that Scott and other breeders target for improvement of crops and animals are disease resistance or resistance to insect pests as well. We know that up to 40% of plant productivity in the developing world is already lost to pathogens and pests. By studying the biology of these diseases in these organisms, we hope to be able to come up with new strategies to improve these crops or animals, in fact. In one example, in a collaboration with plant pathologists, entomologists, and weed scientists, we've developed novel insights into how this nasty pest, the Russian wheat aphid, which is shown on the slides, attacks plants. It turns out that the aphid, when it's feeding on the plants, releases bacteria into the plant, so it doesn't brush its teeth, as one of my students used to say. And its microbiome, the bacteria in that microbiome suppress plant defense responses that enable the aphid to feed on the plant. So the aphid uses bacteria to be able to gather food from the plants. What does this mean? This means that when we think about how we can improve crops in terms of resistance to the aphid, maybe we shouldn't be breeding for resistance to the aphid. We should be breeding for resistance to that bacterial pest, which doesn't move around as much as the aphid and is easier to breed for. So the point I want to make here is that by looking at this as a system, plants, insects, bacteria, we were able to come up with new strategies for how to improve crops for disease resistance. Conceptually similar issues face animal scientists and animal breeders, and my colleague Jeff Steiner will expand more on the genetics of animal improvement that are ongoing at CSU. Well, this slide here shows a field of soybean, Roundup Ready soybean. Now, how many of you can see soybean in that field? This is kind of like, where's Waldo? What you're looking at is a field of a really nasty Roundup Ready or glyphosate resistant weed that has evolved to overcome the effects of glyphosate. And scientists at CSU figured out how that happens. And by looking and understanding and how these weeds evolved to overcome this herbicide, they figured out ways to better control the weed pest in the field populations. Well, water is a big issue in Colorado. And in Colorado, except for this year, we normally deal with too little water. Drought is a huge threat globally, and it's threatening our food security on a large scale. In the US alone in 2012, the severe drought in California, Colorado, Kansas, we suffered crop losses of up to $20 billion across the country. My colleague Courtney Jahn will discuss some of the approaches that CSU is taking to solve these water issues and develop climate-smart crops in Colorado. In Colorado, we're really concerned about food safety issues. The worst foodborne illness in the USA was the 2011 outbreak of listeriosis, that was food poisoning that was caused by the consumption of contaminated cantaloupe produced in Colorado. 30 people died, and 147 cases were reported nationwide. CSU scientists were involved in the investigations that discovered this and are continuing research at CSU to find solutions for this and other food safety issues. My colleague Paul Morley will describe how we're using state-of-the-art technologies to investigate microbial ecology in food production, particularly relating to antimicrobial resistance, foodborne pathogens, and environmental health and sustainability. Well, agriculture is a system, and it's important, again, to think of this whole thing as an ecosystem. If we manipulate one component of that system, we're likely to see effects on other components in the system. I described to you earlier about how by understanding how the Russian wheat aphid used bacteria to manipulate plants, we might be able to modify the plant responses to the aphid and control the problem. With intensification of agriculture, for example, by using high-yielding crops, crop varieties, fertilizer, irrigation, and pesticides, we have seen tremendous increases in yields over the past 50 years. But that intensification has caused problems that are impacting our environment. We've seen decreases in biodiversity or eutrophication of water systems, increased greenhouse gas emissions, and tremendous soil degradation and erosion. Healthy soils are a particularly important part of agriculture and part of what we consider the phytobiome, how that agriculture fits in with the microbial communities around it. We hope at the very least to prevent future degradation, and at the very best to enable scientists or farmers to restore or build those degraded soils back up again. And Courtney Jahn, again, will describe some of CSU's techniques and research that are involved in those areas. Well, one of the ways to increase or improve crop productivity is to design crops that fit precisely the target environment. To do this, we need to be able to rapidly evaluate thousands of different germplasm lines so that we can pull out the genetic diversity that will enable us to solve these or answer these questions. At CSU, we've been collaborating with the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines to develop these optimized field-based spectral imaging systems that allow us to predict variation in single plants in a rice field over in a high throughput way. We can measure with these systems 2,500 yield plots in an hour and get much more information than you get when you have a single graduate student out there measuring with a measuring stick, and we get a lot more information. But the issue is that we then have to integrate that information into a system that will allow us to predict and translate that information to the farmers. So by integrating the big amounts of data captured in those high throughput phenotyping systems, we can now begin to help farmers on the fly to deliver the right input, whether it be seed or fertilizer, at the right time and in the right place. Precision agriculture means that you might, in the same field, use very different technologies to produce higher yielding plants. So Khosla, who is a leader in the area of precision agriculture, will describe how these innovative approaches and cost-effective techniques are enabling agriculture in Colorado. And Graff will also address some of the importances of these ag innovations for the future. So with that, I will begin to turn this over to my panel, but I want you again to remember that we think about this as a system. Agriculture is a system that involves not only the farmers and how they implement the technologies that we design in a way that will intensify or increase the productivity of the land, but also it is thinking about how we can do that in a very sustainable way. We need to feed the future safely and securely, but in a sustainable way. So with that, I'll invite my panel up. And I don't know if they're going to be as obedient as the previous panel, but they are good people. And they have good things to say. So the panel consists of Raj Khosla, who is a CSU Montfort professor and specializes in precision ag. Courtney Jahn, who is an assistant professor at CSU and works to improve bioenergy plant yields as well as soil health. Jeff Steiner, who is the associate director of the CSU Experiment Station. Paul Morley, a veterinarian and a professor who specializes in control of infectious diseases of animals. Greg Graff, who is an associate professor who specializes in the economics and policy of scientific research and innovation. A very diverse group with lots of interesting things to say. And we're going to start with Raj.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Jan. We're talking about food, and we know how to grow food. In fact, we know how to grow food quite well. Just to share with you a couple of statistics, if we were to look in the last 100 years, we have gone from producing 25 bushels of corn to an acre to today more than 150 bushels of corn from the same piece of land, 6 times more than what we did 100 years back. And I know farmers in Colorado that I work very closely with that are pushing 300 bushels to an acre on any year basis. Not too far from here, there's a farmer, David Hula, who clocked 406 bushels of corn to an acre and created a world record. Well, if we are doing so well, and based on the statistics that I've shared with you, why are we questioning our ability to continue to do well and feed the 9 billion population or so in the next 34 crop growing seasons? Because we're at a point where pushing planetary boundaries of how much land we have to produce food, or how much water we have left to produce food, or how much nitrogen or other nutrients that we're using. Let me give you a flavor. What does it take to produce 150 bushels of corn? Last year alone, our planet used 115 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer. Our best global nitrogen use efficiency estimates are in the proximity of 40 to 50%. Do a quick math. That means 60 million tons of nitrogen were not consumed by the plants. And that's released in the biosphere. We heard carbon dioxide. Well, nitrous oxide, agriculture is the largest emitter of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere, and every molecule of nitrous oxide is 300 times more potent than every molecule of carbon dioxide. Agriculture is the largest source of emitter of nitrous oxide. How do we change that? We cannot continue on the same trajectory. And that's exactly the kind of program I run at Colorado State University called Precision Agriculture. How do we apply the right input at the right time, at the right place, in the right amount, in the right manner, so that we can maximize efficiency, maximize productivity, maximize profits, and have the smallest footprint on the planet? What you see here up on the slide, we are using UAV to monitor crop health. We're developing a wireless sensor network so the farmers know when to apply, how much to apply, and where to apply in terms of water. We're working with a suite of biosensors trying to communicate with plants. Hey, how you doing? What would you like? Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium? We're trying to understand these digital signatures, again, to maximize our efficiency, maximize output with the smallest footprint on the planet. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Courtney Jahn. As Jan said, I'm an assistant professor at CSU. I'm also an associate director of the new Innovation Center for Sustainable Ag. And the nice thing about coming after a first group is that you get to play off them. I was also, the first year I was at CSU, paid for by Chevron. And so you can have these connections, whether you consider them an enemy or not. I work on sorghum, as already mentioned by Ken in the previous panel. Usually what I try to do is improve it for energy purposes, but this crop is also incredible when it comes to dealing with dry land stresses. And so one of the things that I do work on, along with many others at CSU, is drought stress. I want to highlight that a little bit today, talk about what specific people are working on. I also want to touch on some of the work that has to do with soil health. And then also I'm going to touch on Scott Haley, who's already been mentioned, and talk about what he's doing in trying to breed plants directly for industry use. And so one of the first people I want to talk about is Jahn McKay. He's an evolutionary biologist. And so what he does is he looks at very simple model crops, and he tries to understand how they have adapted to drought. And then he takes this information and applies it to much more complex systems like rice and brassica species that we might use for energy production. He has a good collaboration with Pat Byrne, and they have a course that helps helps train breeders for drought tolerance. To date, they've trained about 100 stakeholders, both nationally and internationally. Some of the folks have come from the CGIAR centers as well as private breeding companies, and so they work in trying to train folks to deal with these next problems. Scott Haley is the wheat breeder at CSU, and he has a good collaboration with Ardent Mills, a flour producer. They and Scott have come up with a variety of wheat that they use in their whole grain products. It's incredibly white, and so it is ending the child-parent long-time struggle about, can I please have white bread? They're using whole grain to produce a more nutritious white bread. And one of the last things that I want to touch on today is the work of Megan Shapansky, and this deals with soil health. Jan already mentioned that many of the soils that we deal with globally are already degraded. Megan is trying to form these connections between soil health and its ability to produce crops in drought scenarios. And in this case, she's found that these soils that are healthy can reduce both water and soil erosion. They have higher carbon content, which allows for increased intensification of agriculture. So kind of to summarize, what we're trying to do to help feed the future of this group is pull in smart, climate-smart crops that provide for the producers, as well as dealing with soils in a way to have a more sustainable intensification. And with that, I will pass it on to Jeff.
Thanks a lot, Courtney.
I thought you had some sound on your side.
That won't be used against my time limit.
Oh, yeah.
Right, so, I hope that you're starting to see, I'm Jeff Steiner, and I hope that you start to see the theme of that there are many different tools that can be used together that will help address these issues of agricultural productivity. There's no silver bullet. And as you see on this slide up here, just to lead into it, there's, long-term productivity growth is really the key to meeting the agricultural demand into the mid-century. And as you can see in this map behind me, the amount of productivity growth, that's the increase that we see year after year after year in production, is highly variable across the world. And you can even see in the United States there's a great deal of variability. And what's very important to understand is what separates those places that are seeing rapid increase in productivity versus those that are not really is an investment into research and development, and it is into technology and applying these tools. And if we're going to see an increase in productivity in places like sub-Saharan Africa, which not only is showing not a great increase in productivity growth, but also it's places like that and other places in Eastern Asia and so forth where there is also the greatest increase in population, which is going to mean demand. We see the problems of these coming together, both productivity growth, increasing population, meeting demand, and how will that happen. So I'm going to just focus for a few moments on examples of looking at crop and livestock genetic improvement and the tools that are related to this and how those then relate to increase productivity. A couple of our faculty members at CSU, Milt Thomas and Mark Enns, along with USDA researcher Harvey Blackburn, are working on a very novel database that's going to be able to provide free access information to animal breeders all across the world. Not only will this database, which is being built upon the advances that have happened in Holstein dairy industry and in the Angus beef industry, but even to more minor breeds that are found around the world, will help use the genomic tools that are now available in animal breeding to be able to be applied across the world to all breeds. This is going to have marvelous results in the future, and particularly, as I mentioned, too, the specialty breeds and their ability to use the high-powered analyses that are now available to these major livestock breeds. There's already been a great deal mentioned about the Colorado State's wheat breeding and genetics program, but what also lies behind that is a very intensive field testing program that is integrated with the breeding methods, genomics, genetics, looking at such things as haploid breeding methods, which can be double haploids that can be used to advance those new varieties quicker than 12 or 14 years. But it's because of those advances in bringing that together, along with a very strong partnership that we have with our industry partners, we're seeing much more advances, and actually Colorado bucking the trends in wheat yields that are not being found around the world. Finally, our potato breeding program at Colorado State is not only coming up with the most advanced varieties for increased productivity as well as disease resistance, but is bringing in these features of nutritive characteristics and specialty potatoes, which are having great market penetration. You may not know, but of the 4 potato varieties being sold nationwide at Costco, 3 of those are Colorado State developed varieties. So when we look at this, again, breeding, animals, crops, great advances are being made at Colorado State. It is an integrated program, and it's contributing to an overall systems package. So Paul, I'll pass it over to you now.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm sure you're all aware of the critically important issue of antimicrobial resistance in our society, and even the federal awareness that's been paid to this recently through President Obama's executive orders and the impact on policy work. Our research group at CSU has been investigating this issue in agriculture and its impact on sustainability for over 2 decades. Good agriculturists, that is farmers and ranchers, have always been concerned about the sustainability of production practices. However, today's enhanced societal concerns about microbial safety and its impacts on public health and environmental sustainability can sharply contrast the need that has been talked about for increased food production and increased intensification. We need more food, and this is going to require modern production practices, but these production practices have to be safe for people and the environment. We're very excited about where our research has taken us in the past few years. We're using the same state-of-the-art genetic sequencing tools that are used in the most advanced studies of the human genome, and this is providing us an unprecedented view of bacteria and the microbes that fill our world. The types of bacteria that we come into contact with are critical to our health, the health of animals, the safety of our food, and the health of entire ecosystems. There can be as many as 1,000 billion bacteria in half an ounce. I'll say that again, 1,000, that's like, you know, Carl Sagan, billions and billions, right? But seriously, 1,000 billion bacteria in half an ounce of soil or manure. And it'd be impossible to really investigate all of those bacteria using the methods that were considered advanced when I started my career. Using genetic sequencing, we're able to investigate entire populations of bacteria that can be found on meat, manure, soil, wastewater, plants, and we're working to understand how these bacteria move from one part of an ecosystem to another. Sequencing technology is completely revolutionizing our understanding of antimicrobial resistance. To compare it, you might think of trying to understand the Milky Way using a pair of binoculars as opposed to using the Hubble telescope. And that's the level difference in detail that we're getting out of this. Some examples of what we're learning through this work would include We know that state-of-the-art harvest techniques that were developed at CSU and are used in harvest facilities around the world to improve meat safety dramatically decrease the pathogen load of the meat that's presented to society. But we're now also finding that these same techniques actually reduce the likelihood that you'll be exposed to antimicrobially resistant bacteria. We're learning that bacterial populations found in feces, soil, and water in the rearing environments of animals are actually quite different, right? And that's important because then we understand how these different materials pose a risk difference as we're exposed to them in our populations. We're identifying critical action points that we can use to decrease the number of resistant and disease-causing bacteria that reach humans in the environment. For example, we know that cattle that are raised in different environments have dramatically different bacterial populations and different resistance genes that are found in those bacteria. But when we put those populations together, there's actually a consolidation, a contraction of the bacterial populations, and this actually means a reduction in the number of resistance genes and the type of resistance genes that we find in those group cattle. So something as simple as how we group cattle can actually improve antimicrobial resistance and its impact on our health. It's an exciting time to be a veterinarian and agriculture scientist, and I'm proud to be working among scientists at CSU that are helping to lead us to safer and a more secure food supply for the future.
Good afternoon. Sorry, my name is Graff, and I'm an agricultural economist. And I'm afraid that before accountants stole the phrase, we were the original bean counter. And many people may have not much more of a view of what agricultural economics is than that. But really, as social scientists, it's our job to keep one foot in the technical world of agriculture or resource uses and to understand how the technological advances that our colleagues are working on are impacting markets, how institutions are shaping their adoption, and how policies are regulating whether they go forward or not. I come from a great department. We have a very long history working in water economics, which reflects CSU's history in water. We have leaders in the area of the valuation of natural resources that don't buy or sell, that are not bought or sold on markets, yet we can develop economic techniques to be able to say something authoritative about how we as humans value those resources and maybe put a number next to that. We have people working with the livestock industry, with the crop industry. I bill myself as an innovation economist. And what that means is I look at questions of how innovation arises, how we pay for it as an economy, and what kinds of impacts it ends up having in markets. And as an innovation economist, I watch a lot of these big trends. For example, ones like Jahn showed us, I guess it was Scott Haley's term, that we have 35 breeding cycles in which to double global agricultural production and increase our total factor productivity, an economic term, by the way, Jeff, which he was just sharing with you. It just so happens that our last doubling of total factor productivity in global agriculture took us about 35 years. So as long as we can stay on the trajectory that we've had, we'll be able to get there. Another factor that I really like to dig into is the role of public institutions and private institutions in driving the innovation, the total factor productivity. In a recent study, we looked into how CSU as an institution aligns with the innovation going on inside the Colorado economy in the industry that we would describe as encompassing the agricultural value chain. In fact, you see the image that arose from this study on the screen. And what we were able to highlight was that CSU makes a major contribution. Maybe if we can push one more button there, Jan.
One more?
Something changed. What did you do? The bulk of the published science coming out in the agricultural area arises from Fort Collins, which is up in the north of the state there, and one of the blue bubbles that is appearing. It's actually about twice the size. I think it may be shrunk or something. So Fort Collins and CSU is the font of new knowledge, but it's the implementation of that knowledge in commerce that really starts, that's where the rubber meets the road. The red bubbles are the patenting in agriculture and food within the state of Colorado, and what we see is a very tight concentration of that, even more in the metro Denver area. And what this illustrates to us is that we have, first of all, a very robust innovation economy in the ag and food industry in Colorado. It involves necessarily a synergy between CSU and the other public research universities and federal labs and public research institutions, along with the small tech-led companies and larger corporations, all working together within an ecosystem. Moreover, it's surprisingly urban and concentrated in the Front Range. We have an opportunity in the state of Colorado to really leverage on this nice concentration within our relatively compact urban area to create an engine of innovation driving the advance of agriculture in these next 35 years.
Well, thank you. Apart from the fact that my economist colleague is colorblind, I think we did fine. I would like to open the floor for any questions for the panel, and I would appreciate if you would introduce yourself as you ask the questions so that we kind of get a feeling for who we're talking to. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Joel Cassidy from the class of '74, where I was the editor of the Collegian, so I'm prone to ask questions. Is anyone on the panel working on the other side of the food equation, which is waste, which is a large majority of the production that we have is just wasted, thrown away?
Yeah, about 30 to 40% of food in the developed world is wasted. Enough, in fact, more food than sub-Saharan African produces, which is really a shocking statistic. I don't know that no one on the panel is working on that, but we take that into account when we think about, for example, I'll introduce Elizabeth Ryan, who'll talk in the next panel. I work with rice, and Elizabeth has found a use for rice bran, which is usually scraped off and thrown away, yet it's the most nutritious part of the rice. And she's found that this rice bran has huge health benefits. So, and she'll talk a little bit about that in the next panel. The reason we scrape it off is because it's full of lipids and it goes rancid. And if you have white rice, you don't have rancid rice. But it has huge health benefits, which she'll describe. So we think about waste and how we can make use of every part of the plant. Courtney thinks about how can we use the parts of the plant that we don't eat for bioenergy purposes. So we're trying to reduce waste in many different ways. And I think there's probably waste in it. Yeah.
My colleagues at the in the Department of Animal Science at the Red Meat Safety and Quality Center are known around the world for the work that they've done in pathogen reduction, but they also do extremely exciting work in making sure that we get every nutritious morsel out of the animals that we slaughter for food. This includes the ability to refabricate meats into primal cuts so that we take meats that might not be considered that optimal and actually turn them into cuts that you would enjoy serving on your table. They also work around the microbiology of putrefaction, right, spoiling of food. And so they do a tremendous amount of work around reducing the numbers of bacteria that are on the food when they leave the harvest facilities, and so they last longer in the markets and longer in your refrigerator.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Craig Postaway. Thank you for the presentation. Extremely interesting. Graduate of the College of Veterinary Medicine back in '76. I'm sort of left hanging here. It sounds like you're doing some wonderful things sort of within your individual disciplines, and you do have some cross fertilization, if you will, among them, clearly pointed out. But looking at things from a more global scale, as opposed to a U.S. or Colorado perspective. I'm sort of left hanging with some of the controversies that have come up over the years on the fact that we have this huge population to feed, but we're devoting a certain amount of it to biofuels. We're devoting a certain portion of our crops to protein production with our cattle and farm animals, which isn't all that efficient. We've got issues of antimicrobial resistance that are going to impact productivity, and it sounds like we're trying to get around that a little bit. But how do we solve the competing interest, if you will, in order to ensure that we are going to meet the world's global requirements for nutrition, yet we're still apportioning some portion of our work towards energy production and less efficient use of foodstuffs and crops?
I think maybe I'll talk about that a bit. So I work on sorghum, but I also have worked on rice. And I think part of what we need to look at is how do we use all the things. And so when I worked on rice, one of the things that probably most of us in the room don't understand is that some parts of the world produce 3 crops of rice a year. They harvest the grain, and then they pile up all the rice in the field and light it on fire because you can't turn that biomass over before the next crop goes in. And so you jeopardize your next crop because of pathogens. So some of this work is how do we take that agricultural byproduct or waste or whatever you want to call it and turn it into a way to use it. So some of the work that's come out of collaborations through Jahn's lab has been in Cambodia, where they're making these mills that have a syngas plant in the front. And so they take the byproducts of producing rice grain and are able to make the energy to run the plant. And how do we take that residuals that are left in the field and be able to make a fuel from that? And sorghum is an interesting crop as well because it is a food, it's a forage, and it's a fuel. And are there ways that we can harvest the grain and then also use the plant materials, because the crops can be quite large, to be able to feed our fuel and our energy requirements as well? I think you're absolutely right that we have to think about this in a much bigger way, which is why many of us on this agricultural panel work with the engineers that were just up here, because we have to talk together. It can't be in silos. It can't be.
I think another part of that is our partnerships with industry.
Yeah.
They keep us extraordinarily relevant and honest with each other about not getting too siloed, because they're thinking broadly across this. And we have tremendous partnerships at CSU with some of the most influential industry partners in the world.
Jeff, you want to say?
And as I mentioned, we're just presenting tools. And you're getting to the point about the integration of tools. And for example, Sonia was here from Atmospheric Science, and through the Department of Atmospheric Science and our CIRA group, which is also on campus, working with the Gates Foundation and others, really looking at this whole point of real-time weather prediction, how that works into mitigation of risks with crops. When you look then at the abiotic stress, not only in crops but also in animals, we start to look at a bigger picture of how do you put the whole system together and optimize that, mitigate risk, manage those together. And that's a world issue, not just a Colorado issue.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm Jesse Dubin, and I'm a member of the American Psychopathological Society. And I worked 24 years in CIMMYT, so I have some questions, especially about training, which is dear to my heart, and we're not doing enough, especially overseas, because you all are doing a marvelous job, and of course, Scott Haley, great, I'm all for it. But training people, especially from developing countries, to take this technology back and see it adopted. Borlaug said before he died, take it to the farmer. So we need to be training, yet whenever I go to meetings, I'm always hearing about how great research is going, but not enough about who are we training? Are they going home and moving this technology? Can you tell me something about the training that's going on?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Just this past week, I believe we've finalized the documentation for an agreement with the Borlaug Training Foundation and the College of Agricultural Sciences at CSU. And that's a very exciting partnership that's now emerging. This is a newly created foundation that's strictly dedicated to the training of international students. And that's going to be a very cool thing that we're going to be doing through Colorado State with the auspices of our plant breeding programs.
I think too, I'll reiterate what Ken said in the first panel, is that, you know, we have this an energy training program, and I, in the agricultural world, start off the very first couple of lectures and labs in that class so that the engineers understand the agriculture as well. And you know, this is kind of a recurring theme about the integration, and the training is critical. They have to be able to take it home, and we need to understand all the pieces so that we can move together.
One of the largest NSF grants that we received, and Alan can correct me about this, but one of the largest we received in the last year or two was a $5 million grant that provides training around the sequencing technologies that we do. So it's very important to us.
And in fact, we wouldn't be reporting research without students and postdocs, I can assure you. I think we've run out of time, and I want to thank my panel for staying on time and doing a great job of answering questions. We will be here for the reception later if there are other questions that you would like to ask us. Thank you very much for your attention.